At 68, Walter Hayes knew dead soil by the sound it made. He drove the shovel into his western field. Crack. The blade stopped less than 3 inches down. Walter stared at it. Then he put both hands on the handle and leaned his weight forward. Nothing. He stepped onto the blade. This time the ground broke with another dry snap. Walter lifted a slab of earth almost whole. 20 years ago, soil from this field would have fallen apart between his fingers after a summer rain. Now it came out like broken pottery. Pale brown. Hard. Almost weightless with dryness. Walter squeezed the clod. It resisted. He squeezed harder. It split into 3 pieces and dropped beside his boots. 32 acres surrounded him. Technically, it was still a working farm. Technically, the south field produced less every year. The vegetable ground near the barn survived because Walter kept dragging water to it. And this western field, the worst of them, had become so unreliable that he'd stopped planting most of it. Rain still came. That wasn't the whole problem. When it came hard, Walter could stand at the barn and watch water move across the field instead of into it. Brown streams gathered in the low ground. A few days later, the surface would be hard again, then dry, then cracked. As if the farm had forgotten how to hold on to water, Walter had tried fertilizer. The crops responded for a while. The ground didn't. He'd paid to bring in manure twice. It helped. But 32 acres could swallow truckloads of material and ask for more. And at 68, Walter was running short of 2 things a farm could consume without mercy: money and years. He rested both hands on the shovel. His back hurt. Ruth would have noticed. She always noticed before he admitted it. "You're trying to outwork the problem again," she used to tell him. Walter would say nothing and keep working. Ruth had been gone 3 years. Now he heard her most clearly when she wasn't there. He pulled the shovel from the ground and walked toward the barn. Beside the gate leaned a weathered white sign, "For sale." His son had brought it 6 months earlier. Walter had never driven the posts. He hadn't thrown it away either. That was the problem. Selling made sense. The taxes didn't care how long the Hayes family had owned the place. Diesel didn't care what Ruth had planted beside the porch. And the bank certainly didn't care that Walter still remembered where his father had taught him to back a tractor. His son had said there was no shame in leaving before the farm consumed the rest of his savings. Walter knew he was right. That was why the sign remained beside the gate. Not planted. Not removed. Waiting. A diesel engine growled beyond the trees. Walter turned. The county road ran along the northern edge of his property. Across it stood the coffee processing plant that had expanded the year before. A dump truck appeared through the dust. Walter watched it slow, but instead of continuing toward the plant, it turned onto the unused ground beside his western boundary. The truck stopped. Its hydraulic bed began to rise. Walter narrowed his eyes. A dark mass slid from the back. It struck the ground wet and heavy, even from across the field. Walter could see steam or something like it lifting from parts of the pile. He walked toward the fence. The smell reached him before he got there. Sweet at first, then sour. Fermented fruit. Coffee pulp. Walter had seen the factory discard small amounts before. Never this much. The driver lowered the bed and left. Walter stood at the fence. 10 minutes later, another truck came. Then another. By noon, the pile had become a mound. By late afternoon, it had become a hill. Nearly 80 tons of wet coffee pulp now stretched beside the worst field on Walter Hayes's farm. Walter stared at it. 32 acres of dying ground on one side of the fence. A mountain of somebody else's waste on the other. He couldn't imagine what one had to do with the other. At that moment, neither could anyone else. The next morning brought flies. 2 days later, the smell grew stronger. Walter complained to the plant. Someone told him they were dealing with it. Nothing happened. So Walter did what farmers often did with problems they couldn't afford to solve. He worked around it. August slipped into September. The rain stopped. Day after day. The sun baked the western field. Grass along the road faded yellow. Dust followed Walter's boots. The coffee pile darkened, and Walter stopped paying attention to it. Until one evening, he was walking the boundary with a hammer and a handful of fence staples when something made him stop. Walter looked down, then back along the fence. Most of the grass was brown, exactly what he expected after weeks of heat. But beside the oldest edge of the coffee pile, a narrow strip was still green. Walter stood motionless. Brown grass, green strip, brown field, green strip. Samesun. Same weeks without meaningful rain. Walter set the hammer down. He climbed across the fence, up close. The pulp smelled worse than he remembered. He ignored it. The green grass followed the edge of the pile for several yards before thinning away. Walter crouched. He touched the grass, then the exposed ground beside it. Warm. Dry. He looked at the dark coffee pulp. For several seconds, he did nothing. Then he pushed 2 fingers beneath its outer edge. The soil underneath was cool. Walter stopped. He pushed deeper. Cool. And damp. He pulled his hand out and rubbed the soil between his fingers. 20 feet away. His western field was hard enough to stop a shovel. Here. After the same dry September, dirt clung dark beneath his fingernails. Walter looked toward the farmhouse, then toward the dead field, then back at the 80-ton pile he'd spent weeks wishing someone would remove. Something underneath it was behaving differently. He didn't know why. He didn't know whether the pulp was helping the ground or simply hiding moisture for a few extra days. And after 68 years of farming, Walter knew better than to build a miracle out of one handful of damp dirt. But he also knew something else. Good farmers paid attention when 2 pieces of the same field stopped behaving the same way. Walter stood. The sun was dropping behind the hills. He picked up his hammer, left it on the fence post, and started walking toward the barn. Not for another complaint. For his shovel. Because for years Walter had been asking why his farm was dying. That evening, 80 tons of waste gave him a different question. What was happening underneath it? Walter returned before sunrise with his shovel. He went straight to the green strip. The coffee pulp looked worse in the morning light. Its surface had darkened into a wet, matted crust. Fruit skins and fibrous pieces clung together, and faint warmth rose from several places where the pile was deepest. Walter pushed the shovel into the center, then pulled it back. Warm. Much warmer than the September air. He moved to the older outer edge, where only several inches of pulp covered the ground. That was where the grass was still green. Walter scraped the material aside. Dark soil appeared underneath. He pushed the shovel down. The blade entered almost 6 inches before meeting serious resistance. Walter stopped. Yesterday, he'd used his fingers. Today he wanted a comparison. He walked 20 feet into his western field and drove the same shovel into the ground. Crack. Less than 3 inches. Walter stepped onto the blade and forced it deeper. A pale slab broke loose. He carried it back to the fence and placed it beside the soil from beneath the pulp. One was pale, dry and hard. The other was darker, cooler and moist enough to crumble between his fingers. Same field, same weather, same weeks without meaningful rain. Walter stared at both samples. One good patch could lie to you, so he kept digging. At the northern edge of the pile, the soil was damp. Near the middle, damp again. At the southern end, where the pulp was thinner and newer, the difference was smaller. Walter noticed that. He pulled the notebook from his shirt pocket. Older, edge strongest difference. That bothered him. If the pulp was simply blocking sunlight, why did some sections behave differently from others? Walter looked toward the enormous pile. Yesterday he'd found a clue. Now the clue had developed a pattern. A pickup truck approached from the plant. It stopped near the pile, and Daniel Ruiz climbed out. Daniel handled waste for the coffee operation. Walter had spoken to him when the dumping started. Though neither man had enjoyed the conversation, Walter pointed with his shovel. How much is here? Daniel glanced toward the mound. About 80 tons. Why here? Daniel hesitated. Because moving wet pulp costs money. Walter looked at the pile. What do you normally do with it? Move it somewhere else. Store it. Let it break down. Depends what we can arrange. Break down into what? Daniel shrugged. Eventually, organic material? Walter said nothing. Daniel looked toward the plant. For us, the problem is volume. Coffee comes in. Pulp comes off. It has to go somewhere. So that's what this is to you. What? A problem. Daniel gave a tired laugh. An 80-ton problem? After he left, Walter remained beside the fence. For most of his life, useful things arrived on his farm with invoices attached. Seed, fertilizer, lime, diesel, manure. Yet somebody had just spent money getting rid of 80 tons of organic material. Walter wasn't ready to call it valuable, but the contradiction interested him. That afternoon, he returned with 2 old coffee cans. He filled both with equal amounts of hard soil from the western field, same soil, same amount, into the first can. He poured a measured amount of water and left the surface bare. He gave the second the same amount of water, then covered it with several inches of older pulp from the edge of the pile. He set both beside the barn. Then he waited. 3 hot days passed. Walter checked the uncovered can first. The surface was dry and hardening. He pushed his finger into it. Warm. Then he lifted the pulp from the second can. The soil beneath was cool. He pressed one finger down. Moisture darkened the skin around his nail. Walter checked the first can again. Then the second. Body. Covered. Warm. Cool. Drying. Still damp. Walter sat back on his heels. That didn't tell him what coffee pulp would do to crops. It didn't tell him whether spreading 80 tons across his farm would help or destroy what little productivity remained. It didn't even prove the pulp itself was special. But it proved something simpler. Covering the soil changed what happened to water after it arrived. Walter looked across the yard toward the western field. For years he'd been asking how to get more water onto that ground. He had never seriously asked why the water he already received disappeared so quickly. Beyond the fence, the coffee pile sat dark beneath the afternoon sun. Walter no longer saw 80 tons of garbage. Not yet a solution. Either. He saw an experiment he didn't understand. And the oldest edge of that pile was already telling him where to look next. Walter didn't spread a pound of coffee pulp on his farm. Not yet. For the next 11 days, he watched it. Every morning. Before feeding the chickens or checking the vegetable plot. He walked the western boundary with his shovel and a small notebook in his shirt pocket. September gave him exactly what he needed. No rain. By the 6th dry day, the pasture had begun losing color. By the 9th, dust followed his boots. By the 11th, the western field felt almost as hard as it had in August. But one thing refused to change. The narrow strip beside the oldest coffee pulp stayed green. Not lush. Not miraculous. Just alive. Walter trusted that more. He drove 3 wooden stakes into the ground. The first went beside the oldest edge of the pulp. The second stood 6 feet away. The third stood 20 feet into the field. Then he started digging. At 20 feet, the shovel stopped with the familiar crack. Walter forced it deeper and lifted a pale chunk of earth. Dry. Hard. At 6 feet, the shovel entered slightly easier. Then Walter returned to the first stake. He pulled the coffee pulp aside. The sour smell rose immediately. Walter waited for it to clear. Then pushed the shovel down. 4 inches. 5. 6. No crack. He lifted a slice of soil and squeezed it. The handful held together for a moment, then broke softly between his fingers. Walter walked back to the third stake and picked up a piece of exposed soil. It crumbled into dust. He stood with one sample in each hand. Same field. Same September. Different ground. Walter opened his notebook. 20 feet dry. Hard. 6 feet slightly better. Under old edge cool. Moist. Workable. Then he stopped. The coffee can experiment had already shown him that cover could slow moisture loss, but something here looked different. Walter returned to the pile and dug beneath its oldest edge. Near the surface, he could still recognize coffee skins and fibers. Deeper down, the pieces had softened. Their edges were disappearing. The material had become darker. He separated a handful with his fingers. Thin white threads ran through part of it. Walter frowned. He didn't know exactly what they were, so he didn't pretend to. He wrote, "White threads, older material." Then he noticed movement. An earthworm curled away from the light. Walter froze. He carefully replaced the material, 3 feet away. He dug into exposed ground. Nothing. He sat back on his heels. Until that moment, Walter had been asking whether the coffee pulp contained something useful, a nutrient, something crops could consume. But what he was seeing suggested a different question. Maybe the important thing wasn't only what was inside the pulp. Maybe it was what happened when soil stopped sitting bare beneath the sun. Walter took 4 shovel loads from the older edge and carried them toward the barn. He chose 2 patches of exhausted ground, side by side. He left one bare. Over the other, he spread a shallow cover of the older material. No seed, no fertilizer, nothing else. 4 days later, the bare patch had baked hard. Walter scratched it with 2 fingers. Dust gathered beneath his nails. Then he pulled the material from the neighboring patch. The soil underneath was cooler. He pushed 2 fingers down. They entered easily. Walter stayed there for a moment and remembered Ruth. Years earlier, she had covered the soil around her tomatoes with straw. Walter had complained that the garden looked messy. Ruth hadn't even looked up. "I'm not decorating dirt," she'd said. "I'm keeping it covered." Walter smiled. He hadn't understood why that sentence mattered then. Now he looked across the western field. 32 acres of soil had spent years exposed to summer heat, pounding rain and drying wind. Whenever the ground weakened, Walter had asked what he needed to add. More fertilizer, more manure, more water. But perhaps there was another question. What had the soil been forced to endure? He walked back to the 80-ton pile. The top still looked like waste. Wet, sewer, unpleasant. Walter ignored it. He pushed the shovel beneath the oldest edge. The blade entered the ground with almost no fight. He stopped, then pushed again. For years, that field had resisted him. Here, beneath something everyone wanted removed. It didn't. Walter rested both hands on the shovel. He still didn't know whether coffee pulp could save anything. He didn't know what the white threads meant. He didn't know why worms had returned there first. But he finally understood where the real mystery was. Everyone, including Walter, had been staring at the 80 tons piled above the ground. The important changes were happening underneath it. Walter waited until the oldest edge of the pile had been sitting for nearly 2 months. Then he went deeper. At 68, digging wasn't something he did casually anymore. His shoulders stiffened quickly, and his lower back usually reminded him of every shovel load the following morning. But curiosity had become stronger than discomfort. Walter chose 3 places. One beneath the oldest edge of the coffee pulp, one beneath a thinner section, one 20 feet into his dead field. He wanted comparison, not hope. At the exposed field, the first 4 inches were exactly what he expected. Hard, dry, pale. The shovel broke the soil into angular chunks. Walter picked one up and crushed it against the handle. Dust fell between his fingers. He marked the hole. A. Body. Then he moved to the thin layer of pulp. The shovel entered more easily. The soil was cooler and slightly darker. B. Edge. Finally, Walter approached the oldest part. He scraped away the surface material first. The top still smelled sour. Below it, however, the coffee pulp had changed. The recognizable skins were collapsing into a dark, fibrous mass. Walter pushed the shovel through it and into the soil. The blade disappeared almost to the step. He froze, then pushed again. No crack, no hard plate breaking beneath his boot. The shovel simply entered. Walter lifted a section and placed it on the ground. The soil underneath was dark enough that he immediately looked toward sample A to make sure he wasn't imagining the difference. He picked it up. Cool, moist, loose enough to crumble. Then something moved. Walter lowered the handful. An earthworm curled back into the soil. Then he saw another. He used his fingers to separate the material carefully. Small roots crossed the upper layer. Tiny insects disappeared from the light. Those pale threads he'd noticed earlier appeared again through pieces of decomposing pulp. Walter didn't know enough to decide exactly which organisms were responsible for what. So he didn't. He wrote only what he could see. More roots. Worms. Moisture. Soil breaks apart easily. Then he added one final observation. Smells different. Walter lifted both samples to his nose. The exposed soil smelled mostly like dust. The material from beneath the older pulp smelled earthy beneath the remaining sourness. That difference stayed with him. He walked back to the barn carrying 2 buckets. One contained soil from the dead field. The other contained material from beneath the pile. He placed them side by side on his workbench. For 20 minutes. He did almost nothing. He just compared them. Walter had spent years trying to make plants grow better. Fertilizer when leaves yellowed, more irrigation when the ground dried. Another pass with equipment when the soil became difficult to work. Each solution had been aimed at the crop, but the coffee pile had no crop. Nobody had planted it. Nobody had fertilized it. Nobody had irrigated it deliberately. Yet, underneath it, the ground had changed. That evening, Walter returned with 4 wooden stakes. He marked a rectangle beside the western field. Not an acre. Not even half an acre. Just a narrow test strip. If he was wrong, he wanted to be wrong cheaply. He loaded several wheelbarrows of older coffee material from the outer edge. Then stopped. A thought bothered him. The deepest part of the pile was still hot. The smell there was stronger. Whatever was happening underneath the old edge had taken time. Walter looked from the fresh pulp to the dark material in his wheelbarrow. They were not the same thing anymore. That distinction mattered. He put the wheelbarrow down. For the first time, Walter understood that simply spreading 80 tons across his farm might be the stupidest thing he could do. The pile had shown him a result. It had not shown him the process. And if the old farmer wanted to rebuild 32 acres of dying ground, he needed to understand what happened between fresh coffee pulp and the dark soil now falling through his fingers. Walter looked at the mountain beside his fence. 2 months earlier, he had wanted it removed. Now he wanted something harder. He wanted to know what it had become. Walter's first discovery created a new problem. He knew the soil beneath the older coffee pulp was different. He didn't know why. And at 68, he had learned that not knowing why was exactly when a farmer could make an expensive mistake. So Walter didn't spread the 80 tons across his field. Instead, he separated 3 wheelbarrows. The first came from fresh pulp near the newest part of the pile. Bright, brown, wet, sharp-smelling. The second came from halfway down an older section. Darker, warmer. The original pieces were still visible, but softer. The third came from the outer edge that had interested him from the beginning. Dark, cooler, partially broken down. Walter placed the 3 samples in separate piles behind the barn. Then he watched them. The fresh material changed fastest. Within days, its center became noticeably warm. Its smell intensified. When Walter squeezed a handful, moisture collected between his fingers. The oldest material behaved differently. It no longer heated as aggressively. It smelled less like fermenting fruit and more like damp organic matter. Walter opened his notebook. He drew 3 columns. Fresh. Breaking down. Older. That distinction became the beginning of everything that followed. Walter had originally imagined the factory waste as material. Now he began seeing it as a process. The pile wasn't simply sitting beside his farm. It was decomposing. Millions of changes, too small for Walter to see, were taking place inside it. The easiest evidence was heat. One cold morning, Walter pushed a metal rod deep into the middle of the pile. When he pulled it out, the buried section felt warm against his palm. He tried the same thing at the old edge. Much cooler. Walter stared at the 2 locations. Whatever was consuming and transforming the fresh material was most active in one place, and farther along in another. That explained something else. The soil he'd discovered hadn't been sitting beneath fresh coffee pulp for 3 days. It had been beneath aging material for weeks. Time mattered. Walter began turning a small portion of the waste, not 80 tons, a manageable pile. He mixed the dense coffee pulp with dry plant material he already had around the farm: old leaves, dry stalks, and coarse residue. The structure changed immediately. Instead of collapsing into a wet mass, the pile contained pockets of air. Walter monitored moisture. Too wet. And the material became heavy and sour. Too dry. And decomposition slowed. He didn't need laboratory equipment to notice the differences. His nose told him plenty. So did his hands. Then Walter made the connection that changed his plan. For years, he had treated his soil like a container. Put seed in, add fertilizer, add water, harvest crop, repeat. But the ground beneath the coffee pile suggested something else. Soil wasn't merely something that held roots upright. It was habitat. Temperature mattered. Moisture mattered. Organic material mattered. And decomposition connected them. Walter walked into the western field and scraped away the dry surface. The ground underneath was almost as hard as the top. Then he returned to the old coffee pulp edge. There, organic material covered the surface. Sunlight couldn't strike the soil directly. Moisture disappeared more slowly. Decomposing material accumulated near the surface. Roots and soil organisms occupied conditions that simply didn't exist 20 feet away. Walter finally understood why his first question had been wrong. He had been asking, what nutrient is inside coffee pulp? But that was only part of the story. The more interesting question was, what happens to the soil while organic material is being transformed above it? That evening, Walter marked out his first serious experiment. 3 narrow strips. The first would remain untreated. The second would receive fresh pulp. The third would receive material Walter allowed to break down first. Same field, same weather, same soil, different treatment. He drove the final stake into the ground and looked toward the 80-ton pile. For the first time, it didn't look like fertilizer. It didn't look like garbage either. It looked like raw material waiting to go through a process Walter was only beginning to understand, and that distinction was about to save him from his biggest mistake yet. Chapter 6. His first experiment failed. Walter should have waited. Later, he would admit that. But after years of watching the western field decline, patience became difficult. The moment he believed he had finally found something that might help. 3 test strips lay side by side. The first remained untouched. On the second, Walter spread fresh coffee pulp directly from the factory pile. On the third, he used the older material that had already spent weeks breaking down. He kept everything else as similar as he could. Same field, same seed, some watering. The difference appeared within days, and it wasn't the difference Walter wanted. The strip covered with fresh pulp began to smell. Not the dark, earthy smell Walter had noticed beneath the older material. This was sharp, sour, fermented. By the 4th morning, Walter could smell it before reaching the plot. He crouched beside the plants. Several looked stressed. A few seedlings had weakened badly. Walter pulled back the pulp. The material underneath was wet and compacted. He pushed his fingers into it. Warm. Too warm for his liking. Walter sat back. He had made the mistake he'd spent weeks trying to avoid. He had seen what old, decomposing material had done near the factory pile and assumed fresh material could produce the same result immediately. It couldn't, at least not the way he'd used it. Walter removed part of the fresh layer. The deeper he dug, the stronger the smell became. The pulp had packed together into a dense, wet mat, instead of the loose, darker material he'd found at the older edge. This looked like something caught halfway through a transformation. Walter looked toward the third strip. That one was different. The older material wasn't producing the same intense smell. The soil beneath remained cooler. The seedlings looked better. Not miraculous, just better. Walter opened his notebook. Under fresh, he wrote, too wet, too thick, heating, plants stressed. Then he underlined one sentence twice. Old pile is not equal to fresh pulp. That realization hurt more than the failed seedlings. Walter had almost taken 80 tons of fresh material and spread it across the very land he was trying to save. Had he done that, he might have turned one problem into several. The factory had called the pulp waste. Walter had nearly made the opposite mistake and called it fertilizer. Neither description told the whole story. He spent the afternoon removing excess material from the failed strip. At 68, every wheelbarrow felt heavier than the one before it. By the seventh load, his shoulders burned. Walter stopped beside the barn and looked toward the mountain of pulp. For the first time since discovering the moist soil underneath it, the pile seemed enormous again. 80 tons. Too much to handle carelessly. Too much to move twice. Too much to misunderstand. Walter walked behind the barn to the smaller pile he'd been managing. He pushed a fork into it. Unlike the compacted fresh pulp, this material contained dry stalks and leaves. It had structure. Air could enter. Walter turned it. Steam rose from the center. He stopped. There was the clue. The heat wasn't necessarily proof that something had gone wrong. It was evidence that decomposition was active. The mistake was expecting plants to live comfortably inside a process that hadn't finished. Walter began treating the coffee pulp differently. Fresh material went into a managed pile. He mixed in drier, coarser material. He watched moisture. He turned sections when they became dense. Most importantly, he gave them time. Days became weeks. The sharp smell gradually weakened. The recognizable pulp softened. The pile settled. Its color deepened. Walter took handfuls from different depths and compared them. He wasn't trying to make coffee pulp disappear. He was waiting for it to become something different. One evening, he returned to the failed test strip. Several seedlings were gone. Walter pulled one dead plant from the soil and held it by the stem. The failure had cost him almost nothing. A few plants, several days, some labor, but it had saved him from gambling 32 acres on an assumption. Walter dropped the dead seedling into his bucket. Then he looked toward the western field. The coffee factory had given him 80 tons of material. The ground beneath the pile had given him a clue, but neither had given him a shortcut. Walter finally understood the rule. The pile had shown him what was possible. Failure was teaching him how to get there. Walter stopped trying to save the plants. That sounded wrong, even to him. For most of his life, every problem in a field had ended with the same question. What does the crop need? More water, more fertilizer, more manure. Something always had to be added so the plant could keep producing. But the dead seedlings in his failed test strip had taught him something 80 tons of coffee pulp hadn't. He had been working too far ahead. The plants weren't the first problem. The ground beneath them was behind the barn. Walter pushed a garden fork into the small pile he'd been managing for weeks. The material no longer resembled the wet pulp that had arrived from the factory. Coffee skins were harder to recognize. Dry stalks and leaves kept the mass from collapsing into a heavy mat. Walter opened the center. Warm air rose against his face. A month earlier, that would have been enough. He would have loaded the material into a wheelbarrow and spread it. Now he closed the pile. Not yet. The words surprised him. At 68, Walter Hayes was finally learning patience from something that decomposed for a living. He stopped checking the calendar and started watching the material. Was it still heating strongly? Did it smell sharp and sour? Did it collapse into a wet mass when squeezed? Could he still clearly recognize what had gone into it? Walter wrote down only what he could observe. Day 19, darker. Day 27, less sour. Day 36, pulp harder to recognize. He wasn't waiting for a magic number. He was waiting for the material to stop behaving like the fresh pulp that had damaged his seedlings. Eventually, Walter filled 2 buckets. Fresh pulp in one, older managed material in the other. He carried them to the western field. The difference was obvious now. The fresh pulp was wet and dense. Recognizable skins clung to his fingers. The older material broke apart more easily. Darker, looser, different. Walter looked toward the failed strip. Then he marked another narrow section with 4 stakes. Test 4. This time, he didn't ask what the material would do to a crop. He asked what it would do to the ground. Walter kept the trial small. He worked with the surface, instead of burying large amounts deeply. Then he waited. After the first hot afternoon, he checked beneath the cover. Cooler. After several dry days, he checked again. Still workable. He pushed his shovel into untreated soil. Resistance. Then into test 4. The blade entered farther. Walter repeated it. Same result. Nothing dramatic happened. That was exactly what he wanted. One afternoon, his neighbor Tom Willis stopped at the fence. Tom pointed toward the dark strip. You growing coffee now? Walter kept digging. No. Then what's that supposed to grow? Nothing. Tom laughed. Walter looked up. Not yet. Tom's smile faded slightly. Walter drove the shovel into the untreated ground. The blade stopped. Then he stepped into test 4 and pushed again. It entered noticeably deeper. Tom watched. What'd you put in there? Walter nodded toward the coffee pile. That garbage? It was. Tom climbed through the fence. Walter handed him the shovel. Try it. Tom pushed into the untreated soil. Then into test 4. He looked at Walter. Tried both again. This time he didn't laugh. Walter crouched and lifted a handful from beneath the covered strip. It broke apart between his fingers, instead of coming up in the hard plates he knew so well. No miracle. No harvest. No proof that 32 acres could be recovered. Just one small piece of ground behaving differently. For most of Walter's life, he had measured a field by what came out of it. Hay, vegetables, bushels, money. Test 4 was teaching him to measure something else. What stayed in? Moisture, organic material, cover, and time. Walter looked across the western field. The crops had never been the beginning of the system. They were the result of it. For years, he'd been trying to feed plants growing from exhausted ground. Now he understood why every solution seemed temporary. He'd been asking the soil to keep giving while rebuilding almost nothing underneath. Walter rested both hands on the shovel. 32 acres still waited beyond the narrow test strip. He wasn't ready for them. Not yet. He no longer needed 80 tons of coffee pulp to rescue his farm in one season. He needed one piece of damaged ground to become better. Then another. Then another. The factory had delivered waste. Walter's first experiment had taught him not to confuse waste with fertilizer. And test 4 was teaching him something more important. He had stopped feeding plants. He was rebuilding the place that would feed them later. Walter gave test 4 60 days. Not because 60 was a magic number, because he had finally stopped demanding that soil change on his schedule. The strip measured barely 40 feet from end to end, against 32 struggling acres. It looked almost ridiculous. But every morning, Walter checked those 40 feet before anything else. And he stopped looking at the plants first. He looked at the ground. After 7 dry days, Walter carried an old screwdriver into the western field. He pushed it into untreated soil. 2 inches, then resistance. He leaned harder. The screwdriver barely moved. Walter stepped 3 feet sideways into test 4. He pushed again. 3 inches. 4. Deeper. He pulled it out and repeated the telo farther down the strip. Same result. Back to untreated ground. Resistance. Back into test 4. Deeper. Walter opened his notebook. Day 18, treated ground easier to penetrate. He didn't write better soil. Not yet. One difference could be an accident. Then the rain came. It arrived hard one afternoon, hammering the barn roof so loudly, Walter couldn't hear the radio inside. He stepped beneath the doorway and watched the western field. For years, rain had done something there that bothered him. It fell on thirsty ground and left. Water collected in shallow depressions. Thin brown streams moved downhill. Soil that had been dry that morning was already losing water by afternoon. Walter watched test 4. The dark surface cover absorbed the beating rain differently. Less bare soil was exposed. Less mud splashed. When the storm passed 20 minutes later, Walter pulled on his boots. He walked straight into the field. Untreated ground first. Water stood in small depressions. A narrow brown stream still moved toward the low end. Walter crossed into test 4. He pulled the organic cover aside. The soil underneath was damp. Not flooded. Not mud. Just damp. He pushed his thumb into it. then marked the spot with a stake. Walter waited. One day, 3. On the third afternoon, the untreated surface had already begun hardening again. The shovel broke it into familiar chunks. Walter moved to the stake. He pulled the cover aside. Dark soil remained underneath. He squeezed a handful. It held together briefly, then crumbled. Walter stared at his palm. For years, he had thought drought began when rain stopped falling. But maybe that was only half the story. A field could receive water and still behave thirsty if it couldn't hold on to what arrived. That thought was bigger than coffee pulp, and Walter didn't trust big thoughts without another test. So he planted the same cover crop across 2 neighboring strips. Same seed. Same afternoon. Same weather. One strip had received the older managed material. The other had not. Walter added no extra fertilizer. For the first week, almost nothing happened. Good. He had learned to distrust instant miracles. By the third week, a difference appeared. The untreated strip had grown, but unevenly. Some areas were thin, others stronger. Across the amended ground, growth looked more consistent. Walter crouched, then ignored the leaves. He dug. Under the untreated plants, roots entered soil that still separated into harder pieces. 3 feet away, Walter lifted another shovel. The upper layer broke apart more easily. Fine roots crossed through it. He found an earthworm near the surface. Walter smiled, then closed the hole. He opened his notebook. More even growth. Ground still workable. He hesitated, then wrote, "Not proof of everything." Underneath it, proof enough to continue. A truck passing on the county road would never have noticed the difference. Walter preferred that. He wasn't trying to make the field look impressive from a windshield. He was trying to make the same result happen twice. That evening, Tom Willis appeared at the fence. He stared at the narrow green strip cutting through Walter's tired western field. "What'd you put there?" Walter nodded toward the coffee pile. Tom looked from the pile to the strip. "That garbage again?" "Not exactly. Looks like the same stuff." "It isn't." Tom climbed through the fence. Walter handed him the shovel. "Die here." Tom pushed into untreated ground. The blade stopped. Walter pointed 3 feet sideways. "Now there." Tom drove the shovel down. It entered farther. He frowned, then tried both spots again. Walter said nothing. Tom crouched and picked up soil from the treated strip. He rolled it between his fingers. "How much of the field are you going to do?" Walter looked across all 32 acres. Months earlier, that question would have tempted him. He would have looked at 80 tons of coffee pulp and imagined spreading it everywhere. Now he looked only at the next section beside Test 4. Another strip. Tom laughed. 40 feet worked. "So you're doing 40 more? That's the idea. Why not an acre?" Walter took the shovel back. "Because I know this strip worked." He pointed beside it. "I don't know about that one yet." Tom studied him. Walter looked toward the coffee pile. The factory had given him volume. His failure had given him caution. Test 4 had given him something more valuable than either. Repeatability. One green strip couldn't save a farm, but it could answer a question, and if the second strip answered the same way, then the first one hadn't been luck. Walter drove a new stake into the dead ground beside Test 4. 32 acres were still waiting. For the first time, that number didn't frighten him. He no longer had to save 32 acres. He only had to prove the next 40 feet. By winter, Walter no longer saw 80 tons of coffee pulp. He saw 3 different things. Behind the barn, he drove 3 wooden posts into the ground and painted them in black letters. 1 fresh, 2 working, 3 field. The first held pulp that had recently arrived, wet, denser, still recognizable. The second held material Walter was managing and watching. The third held older material he was willing to test on his soil. Nothing moved from one section to the next, because Walter needed it. The material had to change first. That was the rule. Months earlier, Walter would have looked at the original mountain beside his fence and asked, "How do I get 80 tons onto 32 acres?" Now he understood how dangerous that question had been. Volume wasn't the answer. Control was. Fresh pulp arrived wet enough to collapse under its own weight. Walter mixed manageable batches with dry material already available around the farm. Corn stalks, dry leaves, coarse crop residue. Enough structure to keep the mass from becoming the same sour, compacted layer that had damaged his first seedlings. He watched each batch. One heated quickly. Another stayed too wet. A third developed the sharp smell he had learned not to ignore. Walter didn't spread those. He adjusted them. Sometimes he turned a pile. Sometimes he added dry material. Sometimes he simply waited. At 68, waiting had become one of the few farm jobs that didn't hurt his back. The turning did. After 20 minutes with a fork, his shoulders burned. After 40, his lower back reminded him that stubbornness wasn't strength. So Walter changed that too. He used the tractor when he could, made smaller piles when he couldn't, and stopped trying to prove he could still work like a 30-year-old. The system wasn't elegant, but for the first time, Walter knew what was entering his field. One cold afternoon, Daniel Ruiz from the coffee factory pulled into the yard. He stood beside the 3 sections. "You sorted all this?" "Some of it." Daniel looked toward the shrinking pile beside the fence. "I thought you wanted the whole thing." Walter shook his head. "I wanted to understand the whole thing." Daniel smiled. "Same difference." "No." Walter walked to the first section and picked up a handful. Fresh pulp squeezed together between his fingers. He held it up. "This goes on my field today?" "No." "No." Then Walter crossed to the third section. He lifted darker material and opened his hand. It fell apart more easily. This might. Daniel studied both. "So, 80 tons isn't 80 tons?" Walter dropped the material. "Not anymore." That afternoon, Walter walked to the western field. 2 40-foot strips had given him the same answer. Now he was ready to ask a more expensive question. He marked out half an acre. It was the largest commitment he'd made since the experiment began. For several minutes, Walter stood beside the first stake. Half an acre looked very different from 40 feet. If he had misunderstood something, this was where the mistake would start costing him. He looked toward the FOR sale sign still leaning beside the gate. Then, toward the half acre, Walter drove the stake deeper. He spread the managed material conservatively. Beside it, he left an untreated comparison area. Same field. Same weather. No hiding from the result. Then he waited. Rain came 5 days later. Walter walked the half acre as soon as the storm passed. Again the next morning. Again, 3 days later, he dug in the untreated section. Then the treated one. He squeezed soil, checked the surface, recorded what he saw. The pattern returned. Covered ground stayed protected. The upper soil remained workable longer. But this time Walter noticed something else. The response wasn't equal everywhere. One corner showed a stronger difference. Another changed less. Walter stood over the weaker section. Months earlier, disappointment might have made him ignore it. Now he drove a red stake into the ground. Check. Then, another. He wasn't searching for places that proved him right anymore. He was searching for places where the method might fail. That was how 40 feet became half an acre without becoming a gamble. By early spring, the original pile beside the fence had shrunk considerably. The western field had not turned into rich black farmland. Most of it was still tired. Some sections remained hard. Years of decline had not disappeared in one season. Walter was glad they hadn't. A miracle would have taught him nothing. This had. Coffee pulp wasn't restoring his farm. A process was. The pulp was one input. Cover mattered. Moisture mattered. Time mattered. How the material was handled mattered. And the soil decided whether Walter's idea actually worked. One evening, he stood between the 3 piles. Behind him was the factory's waste. Ahead of him was the field. Between them stood the process he'd built. Walter finally understood why the original 80-ton mountain had been the wrong answer. A pile could run out. A truck could stop coming. Even 80 tons could disappear. But if he understood the method, he could use other organic material. He could adjust, test, Repeat. Walter looked across the half-acre. For months, he had been trying to discover what was valuable inside a mountain of waste. Now he knew. It wasn't the 80 tons. It was knowing what to do with the next ton. Walter closed his notebook. He had stopped looking for a miracle big enough to save 32 acres. He was building something far more useful, a system he could repeat. The proof came during the first hard rain of spring. Walter heard it before he saw it. Rain hammered the farmhouse roof shortly after 4 in the morning. By sunrise, nearly every low place on the farm held water. The 68-year-old farmer pulled on his boots and walked toward the western field. For years, storms like this had frustrated him. The farm needed water, but when water finally arrived, much of it came faster than the tired surface could handle. Walter stopped at the untreated section first. Small puddles stood between rows. A thin brown stream followed the slope toward the drainage ditch. He crouched and touched it. Soil was leaving with the water. Then he crossed the wooden stakes marking the half-acre test. Walter stopped. Rain had fallen on both sections, but the surface here looked different. The organic cover had softened the impact of the storm. Water still moved in places. Walter wasn't foolish enough to believe he had eliminated runoff, but the ground wasn't showing the same exposed crust. He pushed his shovel down. The blade entered. Walter lifted a section. Moisture extended deeper than he expected. He walked 20 feet into the untreated ground and repeated the test. The difference was obvious enough that he didn't need his notebook, but he recorded it anyway. After heavy rain treated section more workable, less surface crusting. Then Walter waited for the more important test, the sun. 4 dry days followed. By the 5th afternoon, temperatures climbed. Walter returned to the field. He dug untreated ground first. The upper soil had already begun tightening. He squeezed a handful. It broke apart quickly. Then he crossed into the amended section. He removed the surface material. Dug. The soil underneath was still cool. Walter squeezed it. The handful held together. He opened his palm and stared at it. That was when he understood what had really changed. The coffee pulp had not brought more rain. It had not created water. It had helped Walter build conditions that allowed part of his soil to hold on longer to what arrived. For a farm that had spent years moving between too wet and too dry, those extra days mattered. Walter planted the half-acre. He didn't choose an expensive crop. He wanted another test, not another gamble. As the plants established, he watched them through the first dry spell. The untreated comparison section showed stress earlier. The amended ground held longer. Not forever. Eventually, it needed water too. That distinction was important to Walter. Nothing he had built made the farm drought-proof. But the window had changed. A field that once demanded water sooner could wait longer. A soil surface that once hardened quickly remained workable. And every extra day gave Walter options. One afternoon, he dug beneath the plants. Roots ran through the upper layer. The soil didn't look like the black garden earth people photographed for magazines. It was still Walter's old brown soil, but now it crumbled differently in his hand. He found a worm, then another. Walter smiled. Not because worms had magically repaired 32 acres, because they were living in a place where he had struggled to find them the previous year. He returned to the original coffee pulp edge. The pile was much smaller now. Walter pushed his shovel into the exact area where the entire experiment had begun. The ground beneath it was still darker and softer than the exposed field had once been. He remembered standing there months earlier, holding 2 handfuls of soil and wondering what he was seeing. Now he had an answer. Not a complete one, but enough. The pile had protected the surface. Organic material had decomposed. The environment beneath it had stayed cooler and wetter. Walter had taken that clue, made mistakes with it, learned to manage the material, then reproduced part of the effect elsewhere. That was the difference between an accident and a method. Near sunset, Daniel Ruiz drove over from the coffee factory. He stood at the fence looking across the western field. The half-acre test was easy to identify now. Daniel pointed. "That's where you used our pulp?" Walter shook his head. "That's where I used what I turned it into." Daniel looked back toward the remaining waste pile. For months, the factory had measured that material by one question: how much will it cost to get rid of? Walter had measured it by another: what can it become if you stop treating it like something that has already reached the end of its usefulness? He pushed the shovel into the recovered strip once more. The blade sank cleanly. A year earlier, the same ground had stopped it 3 inches down. Walter rested both hands on the handle. His farm wasn't saved yet, but something fundamental had changed. For years, Walter had been trying to keep crops alive on dying soil. Now, for the first time, he could see the possibility of doing the opposite. Keep rebuilding the soil, and let the soil help keep everything else alive. By early summer, the difference could be seen from the county road. Not across the whole farm. Walter wasn't there yet. But the western field no longer looked uniformly exhausted. The half-acre section he had treated held a denser, more even stand than the untreated ground beside it. Walter still refused to call the farm recovered. At 68, he'd lived too long to confuse improvement with victory. That morning, he was checking the managed piles behind the barn when a white pickup turned through his gate. Daniel Ruiz stepped out, but this time he wasn't alone. A second man climbed from the passenger side. Clean boots, pressed shirt, clipboard. Walter recognized the type before Daniel introduced him. "Walter, this is Mr. Keller, operations manager at the plant." Keller looked toward the processing area. 3 piles remained clearly separated. Fresh, working, field ready. "So this is what you've been doing with our pulp?" Walter wiped his hands on his trousers. "Some of it." Keller walked toward the oldest pile and picked up a handful. He seemed surprised by the texture. "This doesn't look much like what leaves our plant." "It isn't." Keller glanced toward Daniel, then toward the field. "We've been hearing things." Walter almost smiled. "Dangerous habit." Daniel laughed. Keller didn't. "The disposal cost on this material isn't insignificant." Walter understood immediately. Months earlier, 80 tons of coffee pulp had appeared beside his farm because somebody needed it gone. Now the factory wasn't looking at a waste pile. It was looking at what happened after the waste pile. Keller pointed toward the western field. "That all from coffee pulp?" Walter shook his head. "No." The answer seemed to disappoint him. Walter continued. "That's from managing the ground differently." He pointed toward the piles. This was part of it. Then toward the covered soil. So was keeping the surface protected. He pointed toward the untreated comparison strip. "And that's why I left that alone." Keller walked into the field. Walter followed. At the untreated section, Walter handed him the shovel. Keller pushed. The ground resisted. Then Walter led him across the stakes. Again, the shovel entered farther. Keller lifted a section of soil. It broke apart in his hand. He looked toward Walter. "You saying the pulp did this?" Walter paused. "No." He pointed toward the original dump site. "Leaving that pile there showed me something." Then toward his managed piles. "Learning what to do with it got me this far." That distinction was important. Walter wasn't selling a miracle. Fresh pulp had already taught him what happened when he treated it like one. He showed Keller the failed test area. Some evidence remained in Walter's notebook. Dates. Smell. Heating. Stressed plants. Then he showed him the successful strips. Walter explained the system simply. Fresh material wasn't automatically field ready. He separated it. Mixed manageable batches with dry, coarse plant residues. Watched moisture. Allowed decomposition to progress. Tested small areas before expanding. Keller listened differently now. Not like a man humoring an old farmer. Like a man calculating. "How much could you take?" Walter looked toward the factory. There was a time when that question would have thrilled him. Free material. More acres. Faster recovery. Now it made him cautious. "As much as I can handle properly." Keller frowned. "We generate considerably more than this." "Then I can't take considerably more." Daniel looked at Walter. "You've got 32 acres. Walter nodded. "And one back." Silence. That was the lesson the factory hadn't learned yet. 80 tons of waste didn't become valuable because somebody found land large enough to dump it on. If Walter accepted more than he could manage, he would simply rebuild the original problem on his side of the fence. Keller looked again at the 3 piles. For the first time, he seemed to understand. The valuable thing on Walter's farm wasn't the coffee pulp. It was the process between the factory and the soil. Before leaving, Keller stopped at the gate. "We should talk again." Walter nodded. "Maybe." The pickup disappeared down the road. Walter returned to the western field. He knelt and picked up a handful of soil from the amended section. Months earlier, the factory had possessed 80 tons of material it didn't want. Walter had possessed 32 acres of land he couldn't repair. On paper, neither problem solved the other. The missing piece had been everything between them: observation, failure, decomposition, testing, time. Walter let the soil fall slowly through his fingers. The factory had come back because it thought the old farmer had discovered a use for its waste. But Walter knew better. He hadn't discovered the value of coffee pulp. He had discovered something much more useful. Waste didn't become a resource when someone stopped throwing it away. It became a resource when someone learned what had to happen to it next. A year after the first truck arrived, Walter returned to the place where everything had started. Most of the 80-ton pile was gone. Some had been processed behind the barn. Some was still breaking down. Some now existed in thin, dark layers across sections of the western field. What remained beside the fence was barely recognizable as the mountain Walter had once wanted removed. The 68-year-old farmer carried the same shovel he'd brought there the first morning. He stopped at the oldest edge, then pushed the blade into the ground. It sank almost to the step. Walter smiled. He remembered doing the same thing 20 feet away the previous summer. Back then, the shovel had stopped 3 inches down. He had needed his full weight to break the surface. Now he lifted a section of soil and held it in both hands. Dark brown, moist underneath, loose enough to break apart with his thumbs. A worm disappeared between the crumbs. Walter let it go. He walked into the western field. The transformation wasn't perfect. That mattered to him. Some sections remained harder than others. Some needed more organic material. Some still dried faster. And most of the 32 acres would require years of careful management before Walter would consider them truly restored. But the farm no longer felt like something he was watching die. He reached the first 40-foot test strip. It was almost impossible to distinguish now because Walter had expanded around it. He found one of the original wooden stakes lying in the grass. Test 4. The faded words made him laugh. Everything had started with 40 feet. Not 80 tons. Not 32 acres. 40 feet. Walter carried the stake back toward the barn. The FOR sale sign was still leaning beside the gate. Weather had faded the red letters. Walter stopped. For months, he'd walked past it without touching it. Now he picked it up. He didn't break it dramatically. Didn't burn it. Didn't throw it into the road. Walter carried it into the equipment shed and placed it against the wall. The farm wasn't suddenly worth a fortune. He wasn't suddenly young. His back still hurt. His savings hadn't magically returned, but selling was no longer the only future he could imagine. That afternoon, another factory truck appeared on the county road. It didn't turn toward Walter's boundary. The arrangement had changed. Walter would take only quantities he could manage. No uncontrolled mountain. No 80-ton shortcut. Material came according to capacity. Daniel had finally understood Walter's rule. If you couldn't manage the waste, you hadn't created a resource. You had only moved a problem. Near sunset, Walter walked the field one final time. He stopped at 2 locations. From the untreated edge, he dug one shovel of the old soil. Harder. Paler. Then he crossed into an area he'd been rebuilding and lifted another, darker, more workable. Walter placed both on the ground. A year earlier, he would have looked at the second sample and thought the answer was coffee pulp. Now he knew that wasn't true. Coffee pulp had been the accident. The lesson underneath it was larger. For years, Walter had tried to repair the farm by asking what he could add to the crop. More fertilizer, more water, more inputs. But the 80-ton pile had forced him to look beneath the crop, The first thing it changed wasn't his harvest. It was the environment at the soil surface. Cover changed exposure. Organic material began decomposing. Moisture persisted differently beneath it. The ground became a place where biological activity could return. Then Walter learned the harder part. Fresh waste wasn't automatically useful. Too much. Too quickly. Handled badly. And the same material could become another problem. So he had stopped searching for a substance that could save his farm. He had built a process instead. Walter crouched between the two piles of soil. The evening sun stretched his shadow across the western field. For almost 40 years, he had believed farming meant making the land produced. At 68, dying ground had finally taught him the opposite lesson. Sometimes the farmer had to give something back first. Walter picked up the darker soil. It crumbled slowly through his fingers. Everyone had thought the coffee factory dumped 80 tons of waste beside a dead farm. Walter had thought so too, until he looked underneath it. What he found wasn't a miracle fertilizer. It wasn't free money. It wasn't even an answer. It was evidence that the ground he had nearly given up on could still change. Walter wiped the soil onto his trousers and walked toward the farmhouse. Behind him, the western field caught the last light. For the first time in years, he didn't see 32 acres he was trying to keep alive. He saw soil, learning how to live again, and an old farmer who had finally learned that sometimes the most valuable thing in a pile of waste is what it teaches you to notice underneath it.